Good afternoon. The Church is sent by Christ to reveal and communicate the love of God to all peoples and nations. Thus teaches Ad Gentes, the Second Vatican Council's decree on the mission activity of the Church, number 10. I doubt that any missiologist would take serious issue with this one-sentence summary of the Church's mission. It's being sent to all peoples and nations, Ad Gentes, to reveal and communicate the love of God. Why then is there a need to rethink Missio Ad Gentes, particularly in the context of Asia today? There will be three parts in my attempt to offer an answer to that question. First, I will summarize the current debate among missiologists on the most appropriate preposition to use in speaking of the mission of the Church. Second, I will attempt to show how Pope Francis's language about mission offers a different vocabulary that, in a way, resolves the debate. Third, I will suggest a few challenges to the mission of the Church ad and inter gentes in Asia today. First, then, a review of the current discussion. Prepositions are important. I recall that one representative for a group of Christmas carolers provoked laughter when, in less than perfect English, he announced, "We would now like to sing at you." That sounded very funny. The preposition sounded somewhat aggressive, connoting that they would sing whether the people around them wanted to listen or not. He would have communicated something completely different had he said, "We would now like to sing for you," or perhaps, "We would like to sing with you." There is a lively discussion among missiologists and theologians precisely about prepositions, whether we should speak of mission as ad gentes, to the peoples, inter gentes, among or between peoples, or cum gentibus, with the peoples. One might say that there are three basic positions, which we might label as retention, 2, substitution, 3, complementarity. First are those who would argue for the retention of the exclusive use of ad gentes, judging that any other manner of speaking would suggest that Christianity is on the same level as other religions and weaken the effort to call non-Christians to conversion to Christianity. A second group proposes that we stop using the language of ad gentes and instead substitute other prepositions, inter and cum, inter gentes and cum gentibus. A third group views the three prepositions as complementary and proposes allowing inter gentes and or cum gentibus to complement the traditional ad gentes language. Within this group, we might note two subgroups. One subgroup is represented by someone like Fabrizio Meroni, who insists on the primacy of ad gentes language and then almost reluctantly recognizes that, as he writes, it makes sense at times to speak of mission inter gentes. A second group, represented, for example, by our own Father Antonio Pernia, the Spaniard Eloy Bueno de la Fuente, the young Chinese Jesuit theologian Antoine Ren, opt for a more robust recognition of inter gentes as a way of speaking about mission. As Father Pernia writes, today more and more, Missio Ad Gentes needs to be understood as also Missio Inter Gentes. He adds, however, that the latter, that is Missio Inter Gentes, should be seen not as a replacement of, but as a complement to Missio Agentes. Perhaps we can look a little into why some would oppose the language of agentes and propose inter and cum gentibus. In a recent article, Eloy Bueno de la Fuente offers a helpful list summarizing the difficulties involved in the preposition ad and also the ambiguities contained in the substantive gentes. For our purposes and within the limits of our time, I would like to highlight difficulties connected with the formulation Missio Agentes from the point of view of Asian mission history. And I do this because I think that sometimes those who defend the exclusive use of agentes language, or even the primacy of agentes language, do so sometimes without a real acknowledgement of the historical mistakes that were made and the wounds that were left. We might say that the primary criticism against the agentes language was the way it was understood and lived during the modern missionary movement. Missio Agentes, to the peoples, suggested a unidirectionality to mission, what Kozuko Koyama, the Japanese missiologist, called the teacher complex. Missionaries were teachers who had everything to teach and nothing to learn. The peoples were there simply to passively receive, with nothing to contribute or to teach the missionaries. This unidirectionality of the preposition ad was compounded by the view of the gentes, the peoples, the nations, the non-Christian and the non-European other. Mario Antonelli, in his recent fine commentary on agentes, strikingly calls this view of peoples outside the church as hamartia-centric, centered on sin, that is focused on the peoples being somehow in the grip of sin without any acknowledgement of the presence or influence of God in non-Christian religions. Thus, even in Maximum Illud, that landmark and still relevant papal document on mission, Pope Benedict XV writes, unbelievers who live in ignorance of God and consequently are bound by the chains of their blind and violent desires are enslaved in the most hideous slavery of all, the service of Satan. That's a completely hamartia-centric vision of the gentes. This hamartia-centric vision of the non-Christian other often went in tandem with what Gioacchino Campese called the asymmetrical anthropology of colonialism, which was, of course, the dominant regime in which the modern missionary movement unfolded. The view of the racial and cultural superiority of the colonizing powers. Often, this sense of religious, racial, and cultural superiority were conflated in the understanding of mission. They were combined. And so, in Sancta Dei Civitas of 1880, Pope Leo XIII praised the sacred work of missions. For this work, he writes, is incredibly beneficial for those who are called out of the filth of vice and the shadow of death, and who, being made partakers of eternal life, are also brought out of barbarism and a state of savage manners into the fullness of civilized life. This conflation of religious and cultural superiority actually marked much of the actual conduct of the modern missionary movement, particularly in the 19th century. One can give the example of the missionaries in China in the 19th century, who were very different from Matteo Ricci in the 16th century. Ricci showed a profound respect for Chinese culture sad to say, the 19th century missionaries in China often spoke with disdain about the Chinese and their degenerate culture and spirituality. I would recommend two excellent recent historical works, Ecclesiastical Colony by Ernest Young and From Christ to Confucius by Albert Monshan Wu, to get a sense of how profoundly rooted this asymmetrical colonial anthropology was among the missionaries in China in the 19th and early 20th centuries. To give just one example, in 1881, Propaganda Fide summarized responses to a questionnaire from European missionary bishops in China. And the summary went like this. This is a summary of the responses of the missionary bishops, all Europeans, about Chinese priests. The Chinese priests are like the people among whom they were born. They are fickle, lazy, ambitious, vain, cunning, hypocrites, liars, ungrateful, extremely greedy for money, easily rebellious, and with regard to chastity, extremely weak. Note that this description of Chinese priests says, this shows that they are like the people among whom they were born. To summarize, the phrase Missio agentes is criticized for the unidirectional teacher complex understanding of mission that it seems to connote, built on a hamartia-centric vision of the non-Christian other who sits in the darkness and the shadow of death. That's a phrase used first by Gregory XVI in Probe Nostis in 1840, and it's repeated by Pius XI and Pius XII. This view of the non-Christian religions as utter darkness was often conflated with colonial asymmetrical anthropology that at its best involved paternalistic efforts to civilize the less civilized objects of mission, and at its worst resulted in racism and a profound disrespect for the cultures and peoples to whom the missionaries were sent. Are unidirectionality and religious and cultural superiority simply things of the past? I recall one brother Jesuit from the Congo, relatively a young man in his 50s, recalling how in his village, foreign missionaries insisted that the Congolese could not become Christians if they did not learn how to eat with a knife and fork. More interestingly, in a recent article, Fabrizio Meroni defends the validity of Missio agentes because, he says, of the need of the explicit proclamation of the truth revealed in Jesus Christ. Of course, without violence, without imposition, without proselytism. Strikingly, however, Meroni's affirmation of what he calls the absoluteness of the truth in Jesus never includes any acknowledgement at all of the truth in other religions. Thus, he speaks of dialogue with cultures and religions simply as an occasion, in his words, to testify to the truthfulness of what we believe, without any corresponding moment of learning or receiving the testimony of truth from others. This is probably the most unidirectional understanding of dialogue that I have come across in an article written not in the 1800s, but in 2019. Inter gentes and cum gentibus. It is not surprising that the two authors who propose that we stop using agentes language do so from the point of view of the religious and cultural pluralism of Asia. In a much discussed article, Jonathan Tan from Malaysia, studying the documents of the FABC, proposes Missio ad inter gentes as the phrase that best summarizes the understanding of mission of the Asian bishops. Living as a minority religion in a vast multicultural and multi-religious continent, but also, perhaps more importantly, with a profound lived experience of the divine presence and action in these cultures and religions. The Asian bishops propose dialogue as the mode of mission, as the mode of sharing the gift of the gospel in Asia. Thus, Tan suggests that for the bishops of Asia, mission is not so much understood as agentes, with its connotation of unidirectional proclamation, but intergentes, being rooted among the peoples of Asia, comfortable with religious and cultural diversity, engaging in respectful dialogue, which involves not just teaching, but also learning, giving and receiving. In a similar vein, Peter Phan, a Vietnamese-American theologian, my former professor in fact, argues that, in his words, in contrast to ad, the preposition inter abolishes the one-way direction from the missionaries to the gentes and radically reframes their relationship towards fundamental interdependence. Living mission intergentes, he says, means an openness to mutual evangelization, having the humility and, in his words, the willingness to be changed intellectually and transformed spiritually by the gentes, as Jesus himself was in his encounters with the Canaanite woman and the Roman centurion. Phan adds that mission, particularly in Asia, should involve not only missio intergentes, but missio cum gentibus, with the peoples, that is, working together with believers in other faiths towards building the kingdom of God in our world, caring together for justice, peace, and care for our common home. Both Phan and Tan would insist that conceiving of mission as intergentes rather than as agentes does not mean denying mission, but concerns rather the way mission is conceived and practiced. However, one might say that it is hard to avoid the impression that in their desire to substitute intergentes with agentes, someone like Peter Phan, for example, overstates his case somewhat, overstates his objections to agentes language. Perhaps he's being provocative, but one might ask, is it necessarily the case, as Phan claims, that using the terms evangelize and proclaim always implies superior knowledge and moral excellence? Does evangelization always mean, to use his words, to proclaim truths of faith as if standing at a pulpit or behind a lectern with a megaphone in hand, teaching like an all-knowing professor? Do the desire and the initiative to invite people to know Jesus and perhaps discover a call to friendship with him in the church always imply that Asians will perceive mission as an attempt to, in his words, destroy their religions? In other words, is there a way of rethinking, re-speaking, re-practicing missio agentes that retains its important and valid elements while purifying it of its unhelpful accretions? And this is where we come to the third group, the complementarity group. And the missiologists and theologians in the complementarity group believe so, because they propose keeping all the propositions to describe mission, keeping them in dynamic tension, allowing them to mutually enrich and correct each other. Mission, particularly in Asia, in other words, should be always agentes, intergentes, and cum gentibus. We don't have time, but this young Chinese theologian adds still another preposition, per gentes. But perhaps the most creative and inspiring rethinking of Missio Agentes comes from Pope Francis. And so we'll now turn to the second part, to Pope Francis. I think Pope Francis offers us a new way and a more creative, more inspiring way, more concrete way of speaking of Missio ad gentes, inter gentes, and cum gentibus. First, ad gentes. How does Pope Francis rethink or re-articulate Missio ad gentes? Perhaps because of its somewhat tainted history, Pope Francis in fact rarely uses the phrase ad gentes. However, I think he retains its most important elements in his most often repeated phrase when he speaks of his dream that the church be a chiesa in uscita, a church that goes forth. In contrast with the self-referential church, concerned about its self-preservation, Francis dreams of a church in which, he says, all of us are ready to obey the Lord's call to go forth from our own comfort zone in order to reach all the peripheries in need of the light of the gospel. Evangelii Gaudium 20. Pope Francis reminds us, thus, that mission always involves the crossing of boundaries, the boundaries of safety and security, which need not always be national boundaries, because those who need the light of the gospel may be physically near, but existentially distant. As Pope Francis said to the bishops of Japan during their ad limina visit in 2015, we are called to go forth, even if that simply means opening the front door of our homes and stepping out into our neighborhoods. Repeatedly, Pope Francis has observed that Christendom is over. Christendom, which refers to that cultural arrangement in which Christianity, its symbols, language, rhythms, leaders enjoyed cultural dominance, privilege, protection. Christendom, which allowed the church to make a clear distinction between an evangelized world and a non-Christian world, which was somehow the object of mission. Christendom is over. Christendom, which allowed the church to wait for people to come to it, leaving culture, as it were, to do the work of evangelization. By way of contrast, Chiesa in Uscita is a church that doesn't wait, but takes, as Pope Francis says, the first step because of its experience of a God who has taken the initiative and has loved us first. It therefore can move forward, boldly take the initiative, go out to others, seek those who have fallen away, stand at the crossroad and welcome the outcast. Evangelii Gaudium 24. Because the gentes are no longer easily identifiable groups or territories, and precisely because the gospel is no longer heard as good news in many cultures, Pope Francis speaks of the priority of first proclamation, which focuses not on moral teaching, but on what he calls the heart of the gospel, what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, at the same time most necessary. Evangelii Gaudium 35. This proclamation focuses on the joy of the gospel, the flourishing human life that the gospel makes possible. It is not an arrogant claim to holding or the violent imposition of exclusively held truth, but rather an offering made in this loving spirit of someone sharing a gift. For example, Pope Francis writes, if we have received the love that restores meaning to our lives, how can we fail to share that love with others? See, it's a vocabulary of gift. Nor is this proclamation primarily verbal. If the church grows not by proselytizing but by attraction, Evangelii Gaudium 15, this suggests that the gospel is best shared by the witness of Christians who live the mercy, joy, and hope of the gospel in their lives. Second, Pope Francis does not use the language of inter gentes, but he makes concrete this essential element of being among the peoples in at least three ways. First, in his constant insistence of being, in his words, a church of closeness. Closeness, vicinanza, is one of the key words of Pope Francis. The church that goes forth, the Chiesa in uscita, does so not to conquer or to dominate, but to imitate the kenotic incarnation of the Son of God, who emptied himself and made himself one with us, one of us, close to us. Pope Francis writes, an evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances. It is willing to abase itself. It embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ and others. It takes on the smell of the sheep. Evangelii Gaudium 24. Like the Lord, this church is close, above all, in his words, to the poor and the sick, those who are overlooked and despised. Evangelii Gaudium 48. For Francis, in other words, mission unfolds first and foremost and always in relationship, in friendship, in closeness, in accompaniment. In his words, standing by people every step of the way. Evangelii Gaudium 24. Secondly, this closeness is marked by listening. Pope Francis's efforts to renew synodality in the Church is precisely inspired by this dream of becoming, in his words, a listening church. To listen to the Spirit in adoration and faith, but also to listen to our brothers and sisters, as he said in his opening discourse at the opening of the Synod in 2021. Moreover, this listening is not simply limited to other Christians, but even to those of other beliefs. Dialogue for Francis is always about listening and learning. He says, carrying on a dialogue means being convinced that others have something good to say. It means making room for their viewpoint, their opinions, and their suggestions. Dialogue, he says, is a capacity to listen. It is to put oneself in the other's place. Finally, part of the mission of the Church is precisely to promote a culture of encounter in a world which is marked by unprecedented division and social aggression. In his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Francis shows that he is deeply concerned by a world in which those who are different from us are seen by many with indifference or fear, as those who are less than human or as rivals, dangerous enemies. And he sees various manifestations in our time of this desire to exclude the other. Excessive nationalism that closes its doors to refugees and migrants, religious fundamentalism, the breakdown of civility on the internet. In such a context, Francis insists that the mission of the Church is to help promote a culture of encounter that sees diversity not as a threat, but as a good. In his words, a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements. Each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless, and no one is expendable. Fratelli Tutti 215. So we have seen that Francis speaks of agendas in a different way when he talks about Chiesa in uscita. He speaks of intergentis in a different way when he speaks of a church of closeness, of listening, and of culture of the encounter. Pope Francis similarly does not use the language of cum gentibus, but perhaps more significantly, he does not only speak about cooperation with other religions, but has enacted it, modeled it, perhaps most powerfully in Fratelli Tutti. This is perhaps the first papal encyclical in the history of the Church in which a pope speaks of being inspired by a Muslim, the Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb. It is probably the first encyclical which ends with a long, substantial quotation from a document, the famous document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, signed jointly by a Catholic Pope and a Muslim Grand Imam. It's in Fratelli Tutti 285. Pope Francis does not view believers of other religions as competitors, but in his lovely words, as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters, Fratelli Tutti 274. Thus, quoting from his own Querida Amazonia, he says that we believers of different religions need to find occasions to speak with one another and act together for the common good and the promotion of the poor. Fratelli Tutti 282. Let's go to part 3. We have explored how missiologists have rethought Missio a gentes by enriching it with notions of inter gentes and cum gentibus. We have reviewed how Pope Francis has rearticulated and deepened Missio a gentes by insisting on a church that goes forth, a church of listening, closeness, and which promotes a culture of encounter, and a church which actively engages in mutual cooperation for the common good with other religions. What might all of this have to do with the context of Asia? Most of us are familiar with the famous triple dialogue, with the cultures, the religions, the poor of Asia, that has articulated the mission of the Church in Asia for almost 50 years. This happy formulation, a neat summing up of the first landmark FABC document from 1974, Evangelization in Modern-Day Asia, was a response precisely to the realities of the continent, its incredible diversity of cultures and religions, and the presence and the suffering of multitudes of the poor. I believe that this statement remains very valid and very relevant. However, the world of Asia has changed very significantly since 1974. I'd like to share a somewhat lengthy quotation from Mary Ho, which captures very well the incredible complexity of Asia today in the 2020s. She writes, Asia is a region of clashing extremes where polar forces hang in fragile tension. It houses some of the fastest growing economies, but is home to 2/3 of the world's poor. It hosts the world's most populous atheistic state, but also vast numbers of Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians. Asia leads the world in digital technology, big data, and disruptive innovation, yet it swarms with large, unskilled populations. Culturally, the region ranges from the formalized Japanese norms to those of the effusive, vibrant Filipinos. East Asia includes the world's second largest sender of missionaries to foreign lands in South Korea, yet is also a hotbed of Islamic radicalism and terrorism. With North Korea's quest to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, the region is tottering on the brink of nuclear conflict. China is also destabilizing the region by establishing bases of the South China Sea, to which neighboring countries also have rights. Asia is a region where polar forces pivot in precarious balance. In the light of this complexity, it seems important for missiologists to revisit the triple dialogue and discern whether there is a need to expand or nuance this understanding of mission, instead of simply repeating it as a slogan. I will not attempt that here, we don't have time, nor do I have all the answers. What I will attempt here is to offer some intuitions, some, if you wish, educated guesses, as we revisit this triple dialogue. First, the dialogue with the poor. Perhaps the most obvious difference between Asia of 1974 and Asia today is that while many countries remain desperately poor, the Asia of 2022 is a much wealthier continent. China in 1974 was a poor country. It is now the second largest economy in the world, with hundreds of millions of people elevated from their former state of poverty. Japan, of course, remains the third largest economy. South Korea in 1974 was a poor country. It is now the 10th largest economy in the world, with its brands like Samsung and LG and its cultural products like BTS and K-drama sweeping the world. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan are all prosperous nations. Indonesia is a member of the G20. Malaysia, Thailand, and increasingly Vietnam, and perhaps to a lesser extent the Philippines, are on their way. There remain, of course, issues, really serious issues of inequality. And in many of these countries, as well as in countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, East Timor, Laos, there remain enormous numbers of poor. And so the dialogue with the poor and the work for social justice remains a vital part of the mission of the Church in Asia. But what is the Church's mission in view of this new widespread prosperity and the cultural changes that accompany it? Second, dialogue with culture. This leads us to dialogue with cultures. In 1974, this dialogue was largely understood in terms of enculturation, the appropriation and transformation of largely Western forms of Christianity into Asian forms, and the rise of Asian theologies and the rich and beautiful diversity of Asian liturgical practices and music are just two indicators of how far we have gone in terms of enculturation. But perhaps in 2022, it is necessary to see this dialogue of culture with cultures in terms of the enormous cultural changes created by this new wealth of Asia. Just to give some examples or some indications, this new affluence has led to massive movements of peoples within Asia. Not from Asia outside, but within Asia. From the countrysides of China and Vietnam, for example, to the mega cities that promise jobs and a better life. From Myanmar, from Thailand, East Timor, the Philippines, Indonesia, to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, which are now major centers for receiving migrant workers. These migratory movements have many consequences, but certainly they involve cultural transformation. As people from traditional rural cultures become exposed to the pluralism of choices in the cities, and as traditional family structures, the locus of transmission of the faith for many Asians, are significantly challenged. This pluralism of choices is precisely one of the landmarks of changing Asian cultures. As sociologists like Hans Joas and José Casanova have pointed out, modernization does not necessarily bring about secularism, but it always brings about pluralization, the possibility of innumerable choices. Global consumer culture and the digital world have exponentially increased the choices of anyone holding a handheld phone, and that's practically everyone in Asia. Not just choices of consumer goods, but also choices of lifestyles and of visions of the good life. This expansion of individual choices is the point. One might argue that Asia in 1974 was already one of a pluralism of cultures and religions. But what has changed, it seems to me, is that modernization, driven by the global market and the communications revolution, has made possible the increased exposure of the individual to possible choices and the increased agency of individuals to make choices, including religious choices. Consumer culture which I would contend is probably the most important shaper of identity, desires, and modes of relating in contemporary Asia, precisely thrives on promoting the individual's capacity to choose products and lifestyles that suit him or her. Digital culture is not just a dizzying exposure to myriad options, but also transforms the individual from being a mere consumer to a creator, someone who projects his or her own chosen meanings and values, including one's image of oneself, through sharing and creating content. Religious faith becomes an option for the individual, rather than simply something handed on by traditional cultures. The possibility of opting out of religion is no longer a decision that meets with social disapproval, as it does in traditional cultures. The 2015 Pew Global Attitude Survey is indicative. In response to whether religion is important to them, only 10% in Japan and only 3% in China indicated that religion was important to them. That same survey notes that young adults are less likely to identify themselves as belonging to a religion in Japan, but also now in South Korea. Mary Ho notes that Hong Kong has seen negative church growth, especially among the younger generations of churchgoers since the 1970s. Singapore has a growing number of atheists and agnostics who now number 18.5, almost 20% of the population. In general, in East and Southeast Asia, Mary Ho concludes, churches are losing their youth and young adults. This is true, she claims, even among other religions. As she writes, as young people pursue wealth and are turned off by radicalism, there is a rise in Muslim atheists in Indonesia and Malaysia. I recall that a Vietnamese Jesuit provincial once said to me that in Vietnam, the threat to the church comes not from communism, but from prosperity. I suppose that meant for him that consumer culture offers a powerfully attractive vision of human flourishing, of what constitutes a good life, which speaks to and captures desires more effectively than the religions. At the very least, consumer culture offers many more alternatives. The fact in the last 20 years, for example, we have seen a massive drop of priestly and religious vocations in China, South Korea, and the Philippines, places that 2 decades ago were regarded as rich in vocations, is suggestive. Third, let us look at the religions. Notwithstanding what I said earlier, Asia remains, of course, a largely religious continent. The growth of Pentecostalism, of Pentecostal forms in Asia, particularly in China, and the prosperity gospel variations of Pentecostalism, particularly in Laos and Cambodia, would be very interesting subjects. But I would just like to underline the growth of what I call identity-assertive tribalisms among religious groups in Asia. I prefer using this neologism to the more familiar fundamentalism because I think it describes the dynamics of such groups more actively. These groups, found not just among the religions, focus on maintaining a distinct communal identity, connected with distinctive markers of language, symbols, attires, costumes. They are assertive or aggressive because they are characterized by anger or by fear, by a perceived threat from larger society. One might call them groups of organized anger. Finally, they involve tribalism because they are closed communities with strict demarcations or boundaries between an in-group and an out-group, between us and them. Let me share just some examples. These are somewhat anecdotal. I recall that in a dialogue with Muslims I participated perhaps 5 years ago in Indonesia, the Muslims expressed great worry about the rise of fundamentalism in their country, challenging the traditionally harmonious and mutually hospitable coexistence of different faith communities in a place like Java, for example. What I found most surprising is that they said that among Muslims, this fundamentalism was linked to a powerful sense of threat from Christians, which is surprising because Christians are a tiny minority. A sense of threat propagated and created by social media. In the Philippines, for example, I find myself surprised by the very vocal and aggressive groups of young traditionalist Catholics who are devoted to the Tridentine Mass and who declare themselves very aggressively, especially online, against Pope Francis's modernist tendencies. Perhaps most worrying is when religious identity and political or national identity are conflated and promoted by populist politicians. Religion is reduced to an element in tribal identity against others, excluding others, as with the Hindu nationalist groups in India or the Buddhist nationalist groups in Sri Lanka and southern Thailand. Where do these identity-assertive tribalisms come from? Where is the fear and anger coming from? Is this development of identity-assertive tribalisms among the religions linked to the perceived breakdown or threat to traditional cultures in the face precisely of the galloping pluralism of options now made possible by consumer and digital culture? I would like to conclude. I would like to end by making a concrete suggestion for your reflection, for our reflection, with regard to Missio ad and intergentis in Asia today. Despite the aging populations in Korea and Japan and to some extent China, UN figures indicate that the majority of the world's youth live in the Asia-Pacific region. 30% of East Asia is between the ages of 0 to 24. In Southeast Asia, it is a whopping 44.2%. It seems to me that the young of Asia are the ones who are most affected by these cultural and religious changes in Asia. As Mary Ho observed, and as I already quoted before, churches are losing their young youth and young adults. Father Francis Alvarez views the situation of youth from a different perspective. On the one hand, he notes that young people value authenticity, a value that has been challenged by the failures and scandals of institutional religions. However, even if young people stay away from the churches or from the religions of Asia, it does not mean that there is no spiritual thirst or search among them. Father Alvarez writes, studies have shown that millennials have a different view of commitment. They sow many seeds. They wait for what bears the most fruit for them and only then invest themselves. Maybe we just have to give them the space and the time to explore. Should Missio ad and intergentis Asiae mean viewing mission to the young people of Asia as a priority? If so, recalling all that we have said about Pope Francis's language of mission, we might ask ourselves questions like the following. How do the churches of Asia go forth from their comfort zones to encounter the young people of Asia? Second, how can we find ways of entering into friendship, relationships of closeness and trust with young people? How can the churches first listen to and learn from the young? Not just their questions, but their idealism, their hopes, their gifts, their critique of our institutions, their search for meaning, values, community. How can we accompany them in their search for their authentic selves? Third, how do we find a language to share the gift of the gospel, not as an imposition of obligations and prohibitions, but as a path to deepest joy and human flourishing? How touch their desires, not just their minds? how to promote encounter with the person of Christ, not just our words and our formulations, and how must we ourselves change if we are to give attractive witness to the joy of the gospel. Finally, studies have shown that young people who join extremist, traditionalist groups are usually in search of a sense of common identity amidst the confusion, isolation, and loneliness of modern pluralist cultures. But as the Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf has pointed out, Christian identity can be created by marking boundaries, as the identity assertive tribalisms do, or by discovering and living from a center, or more precisely, a recentered center in which one can say with Paul, I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. When a person's identity is not based on boundaries but on having a center, things change. He or she can cross boundaries without fear. As my former Father General Adolfo Nicolas put it beautifully, if the heart is right, if the person is centered, you can throw it in the dark and it will find its way. And so that's my final question. How do we help young people of Asia discover and form this centered self, which will allow them to live the culture of encounter without fear, and thus engage positively with those who are different as fellow travelers, as partners in the building of an Asia, of a world that is a little more like the kingdom of God? Thank you, and thank you for your patience.